On the morning of August 25, 1941, British and Indian troops crossed Iran's western border from Iraq, while Soviet forces poured across the northern frontier from the Caucasus and Turkmenistan, launching an unprovoked invasion of a neutral country that had declared no hostility toward either power and whose greatest crime was refusing to expel German engineers working on railways and factories. The invasion, coordinated between the British Empire and Soviet Union just 2 months after Germany's attack on Russia, had transformed these longtime rivals into desperate allies, demonstrated how quickly diplomatic niceties vanished when great powers needed resources, with Iran's location astride crucial supply routes and atop vast oil reserves, making the country too strategically valuable to remain independent, regardless of its proclaimed neutrality. Within 3 days, Iranian resistance collapsed as hopelessly outmatched defenders faced over 80,000 Allied troops supported by more than 1,000 tanks and hundreds of aircraft, forcing Reza Shah to capitulate and accept foreign occupation that would transform Iran into what Winston Churchill later called the bridge to victory, while inflicting economic catastrophe and famine that killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians who starved so that Allied supplies could flow north to the Soviet Union. Iran had enjoyed relative peace with the great powers surrounding it through the 1930s, ruled since 1925 by Reza Shah, who had focused on internal development and modernization while carefully maintaining neutrality between Britain and the Soviet Union, whose imperial ambitions had threatened Iranian independence for over a century. The Shah continued allowing the British-controlled Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to monopolize Iran's southern oil fields, providing Britain with petroleum resources crucial to its empire, while looking to other nations, especially Germany, to import technology, machinery, and industrial expertise needed to modernize his nation. In 1938, Iran completed the Trans-Iranian Railway, an engineering marvel that linked the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea for the first time, running 1,400 kilometers through mountain ranges and deserts that required hundreds of bridges and tunnels, boosting trade and internal mobility while demonstrating Iran's determination to develop without becoming dependent on British or Soviet assistance. The railway, built with American engineering firms and equipped with 65 German locomotives and technical expertise from hundreds of German engineers and technicians working across Iran's industries, represented exactly the kind of independent development that threatened British and Soviet control over the region. When Britain and Germany went to war in September 1939, Reza Shah declared Iran's neutrality, refusing British demands to expel German nationals who the British viewed as potential spies gathering intelligence on oil facilities and military positions. For 2 years, Britain grumbled about German presence in Iran, but took no action beyond diplomatic protests, as the war in Europe and North Africa kept British forces far too busy to worry about Iran, as long as oil continued flowing from Anglo-Iranian facilities in the south. Everything changed on June 22, 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, sending 3 million troops crashing across the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history, transforming the strategic situation overnight, as Britain suddenly found itself with a powerful but desperately threatened ally. The initial weeks of Barbarossa brought disaster for the Soviet Union as seemingly unstoppable German panzer divisions drove hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies while capturing millions of prisoners, raising the terrifying prospect that the Soviet Union might collapse before the end of 1941 and leave Britain alone, again facing a German Reich that controlled resources from the Atlantic to the Urals. British leaders recognized that Soviet survival was now essential to British survival, as a German victory in the east would free millions of Wehrmacht troops to turn west against Britain and North Africa, while providing Germany access to Soviet oil, grain, and industrial resources that would make the Nazi regime invincible. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, despite his lifelong hatred of communism, immediately pledged British support for the Soviet Union, promising to send whatever military supplies Britain could spare to help the Red Army resist German advances. By August 1941, British convoys were running through Arctic waters to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel, braving German submarines, aircraft, and surface ships to deliver tanks, aircraft, and ammunition that the Soviets desperately needed. But the Arctic route had severe limitations, as ice closed northern ports for months each year, while German air and naval forces based in Norway made the convoys extremely dangerous, with some losing significant percentages of their ships to German attacks. British planners recognized that far greater quantities of equipment would be needed if the Soviets were to survive, requiring a safer supply route with greater capacity that could operate year-round without running the gauntlet of German forces. When British eyes turned south looking for alternatives, Iran's newly completed Trans-Iranian Railway appeared like a gift from heaven, offering a direct route from Persian Gulf ports controlled by Britain to the Soviet border that could handle massive cargo shipments if only the British and Soviets controlled it. Alongside the railway's strategic value, British planners had to consider the nightmare scenario where German forces broke through Soviet defenses in the Caucasus and drove south into Iran, seizing the Anglo-Iranian oil fields that provided Britain with petroleum resources essential to its war economy, while potentially linking up with German forces in North Africa to surround and destroy British positions in Egypt and the Middle East. Iran's declared neutrality and the presence of hundreds of German engineers and technicians throughout the country created fears in London that Iran might welcome German forces or even join the Axis. Once Wehrmacht panzers appeared on Iran's northern border, making a German conquest of the Middle East a realistic possibility unless Britain acted first. On July 19, 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union sent a diplomatic note to Reza Shah demanding the immediate expulsion of all German nationals from Iran, presenting the demand as a reasonable security measure that a truly neutral country would accept without hesitation. The Shah found himself trapped between impossible choices, with Germany urging him to resist Allied pressure and maintain genuine neutrality, while the Allies made clear they expected him to side definitively with them by purging German influence from his country. Reza Shah's response attempted to split the difference, promising to deport any German citizens where clear evidence existed of espionage or hostile acts, but refusing wholesale expulsion of engineers and technicians whose skills Iran needed for industrial development. The Shah may have miscalculated, not realizing how desperate the Allied position had become or how much importance Britain and the Soviet Union now placed on controlling Iran's territory and resources. The Allies, unsatisfied by this non-committal reply and convinced they had no time for lengthy negotiations while German armies drove deeper into Soviet territory every day, swiftly decided that Iran would join the Allied cause, whether Reza Shah agreed or not. On July 22nd, Lieutenant General Edward Quinan, commander of Allied forces in Iraq, received orders to prepare an invasion plan, beginning military preparations, while diplomats made one final attempt to bring Iran into line peacefully. On August 16, 1941, the Allies presented Iran with another diplomatic note that was essentially a thinly veiled ultimatum, demanding that Iran expel German nationals and turn over control of the Trans-Iranian Railway and other transport infrastructure to Allied control or face military consequences. When Reza Shah refused, still believing the Allies were bluffing and would not actually invade a neutral country, he sealed his country's fate, as Allied commanders had already assembled forces on Iran's borders and needed only final authorization to attack. General Queen Anne's forces totaled approximately 30,000 troops, mostly from the Indian Army organized into the 8th and 10th Indian Infantry Divisions, with the 10th Division under Major General William Slim possessing the only tanks available in the form of the 9th Armored Brigade. The plan called for the 8th Division to strike into southern Iran, seizing the critical oil facilities at Abadan as quickly as possible, while Slim's 10th Division, with its armor and motorized infantry, would drive into Iran's interior toward the cities of Kermanshah and Hamadan. Soviet forces were even larger, with General Dmitry Kozlov's Transcaucasian Front deploying 3 armies totaling approximately 50,000 troops on Iran's northern borders, supported by over 400 aircraft that would face barely a dozen aging Iranian biplanes. The disparity in military power was overwhelming, as Allied forces brought more than 1,000 tanks and hundreds of aircraft against an Iranian army that numbered 120,000 men on paper but was hopelessly undersupplied, spread across vast distances, equipped with outdated weapons, and had no experience fighting modern mechanized warfare. Iranian forces lacked the tanks, aircraft, anti-tank weapons, and communications equipment necessary to coordinate effective resistance against enemies attacking simultaneously from multiple directions with overwhelming superiority in firepower and mobility. At dawn on August 25, 1941, Allied forces crossed Iran's borders as British and Indian troops advanced from Iraq, while Soviet armies poured across the northern frontier at 3 separate points. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.